He became a captain in the United States Army in 1850. He served for a time in Florida at a fort there. I think he's part of the Mormon expedition that went out to Utah prior to the war. He was in Texas, served in Texas for a time, and of course, at the outbreak of the war, he was the commander of Fort McHenry in Baltimore. And so when you read about the Pratt Street riot and the stuff that's going on in Baltimore at the outbreak of the war, he is stationed there in charge of the fort. And it has some interesting writings about that time period, because it is not clear whether the militia in Maryland is going to side with the Southerners, and they are camped outside the fort. And, quite possibly, they will attack Fort McHenry. So there's a lot of discussion about his role as commander of the fort at the outbreak of the war. Now, eventually, he, after the outbreak of the war, he was given a commission as the colonel of the 1st Michigan Infantry. And because of his Army service and the need for generals, when the Army blossomed into the Army of the Potomac, he was given command of a brigade and made a brigadier general in the 3rd Army Corps when it was under Philip Kearny. He was in charge of a division of the 1st Corps at the Battle of Chancellorsville, but his division was lightly engaged. Of course, he commanded the division at Gettysburg. At Spotsylvania in 1864, he led a charge. His division was ordered to attack. Instead of staying back with the division, he actually led the leading brigade in a charge on May 8th, and he was wounded in the left knee, and his leg was amputated. He received the Medal of Honor in 1894 for leading the charge at Spotsylvania. Most of the end of his life, he was blind, and he died on February 18, 1897, and he's buried in Spring Forest Cemetery in Binghamton, New York. So he's born in Binghamton and he's buried there. I have never been to Binghamton, New York, so I've never been to his grave, but there is I often find a grave. Of course, I put his grave there so you can see it. Now, at the Battle of Gettysburg, General Robinson's division consists of 2 brigades. At Chancellorsville, he had 3 brigades. But I'm sure you know, just at the outbreak of the Gettysburg campaign, a bunch of units, enlistments, ran out. There was a whole brigade of New Jersey troops that was in what becomes Wadsworth's division here, and that brigade, their term of service all ran out on the march to Gettysburg. And a few units in Robinson's division also, their time was up, and so they consolidated 3 brigades into 2 brigades. A lot of these units were consolidated, and they hadn't served together as cohesive brigades until the Battle of Gettysburg. But considering all that, they performed very well. The 1st Brigade of Robinson's division is commanded by Gabriel Paul. He was born in 1813 in St. Louis. When you read biographies of him, they say that his father and his grandfather were officers under Napoleon.
Wow.
But when you look at his genealogy, like I have on Ancestry.com, for the people who have actually done research on him, his father is definitely in St. Louis by 1809. And his grandfather, on his mother's side, is definitely in St. Louis by like the 90s. So I seriously doubt if they were officers under Napoleon. They could have been officers in the French army during the Napoleonic period, but they did not serve in the Battle of Waterloo or Napoleon's campaign. As a matter of fact, I think one of Paul's older, was it Paul's? No, I guess one of Paul's father's sisters is born in Cuba.
Wow.
So, and I think Paul's father might be born in San Domingo or something. So, but you read that often, that his father and grandfather were French officers in the French army. He's born in St. Louis. He graduated from West Point in 1834. So he's kind of a contemporary of Robinson. He did serve in the Seminole War, which I believe in 1842. In the Mexican War, he was given a brevet as a major in the storming of Chapultepec. And of course, the castle in Mexico City and
Jackson.
pickets there. And,
Jackson.
yeah, and Longstreet. We don't talk about Jackson. At the outbreak of the war, he's in command of a fort in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And it takes him a while to get up through the ranks. There was some issue about exactly when he becomes a brigadier general. I guess he was nominated, and then Congress has to approve your nomination, and then it fell through, and then they nominated him again. But he officially became a brigadier general in April of 1863. And Paul was in command of the New Jersey Brigade at the Battle of Chancellorsville as part of Wadsworth's division. But that whole brigade was mustered out of service when their term of service ended. And then Paul is given command of a brigade in Robinson's reformed division. So it's not like he's the commander of these troops for a long time. He's just been there for a few weeks as their commander. I just thought you might want to know something about some of these guys. And of course, Wadsworth is wounded in the temple at the Battle of Gettysburg. And I think, how is it? The bullet entered his left temple and exited his right eye. I know you didn't need to know that. So he's blinded the rest of his life. He loses his sense of smell, and his hearing is very bad. But he lives until 1886. He actually dies in Washington, D.C., and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And I've been to his grave. I'm sure some of the other people who've been to Arlington have been to his grave. And, I always hear this story that there's a photograph of him in the collections of the Theological Seminary. They have a Civil War album of him, a pre-war photograph, but I don't have access to it. And Gary Cross is big on that he has a photograph of him when he has, without, with both his eyes. Obviously, this is a photograph after the war. Let's see. He was, that's all I'm going to say about him. Henry Baxter. It's a little loose. Henry Baxter. He was born in 1821 in Delaware County, New York. When he was 10, his father moved to Michigan, Jonesville, Michigan. In 1849, he went to California in the time of the gold rush, and he actually was a gold miner for a couple of years. Came back to Michigan. At the outbreak of the war, he had no military experience. He was elected captain in the 7th Michigan, eventually became the lieutenant colonel of the 7th Michigan. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, he was wounded. When they were laying the pontoon bridge across the Rappahannock River, the 7th Michigan under Colonel Baxter was sent across first in boats. And they landed on the opposite shore and cleaned out the houses of the Confederate sharpshooters along the shore. So that's really his claim to fame leading that expedition so they could then lay the pontoon bridge to get across the Rappahannock. And he was wounded in an action. Of course, he commanded the brigade here at Gettysburg. He was wounded at the Battle of the Wilderness afterwards. He was made a brigadier general, I should mention, in March of 1863 before the battle. He was, and of course the 7th Michigan, if you don't know, at the Battle of Gettysburg is part of, is it a Horrow's Brigade, and it's, they're near the Angle, their monument, and they're part of the 2nd Army Corps, and helped repulse Pickett's charge. Let's see, I don't know what I have there. He was appointed in Grant's administration as the United States Minister to Honduras. You know, like Longstreet becomes the Minister of Turkey, and Sickles, which he becomes the Minister of Spain. And so they had Henry Baxter cheer list. He's a Minister of Honduras. Honduras? I can't pronounce it right.
That's it.
He died in Jonesville, New York, Michigan, December 30th, 1873. So 10 years after the Civil War. And he's buried in the Jonesville Cemetery in Michigan. And I have not been there, so I couldn't tell you where that is. Now just a few facts and figures about the division. So it has, according to Busey and Martin, and again, these numbers are their own calculations based on a very complicated formula that they give you at the beginning of their book. I always say it like that because so many people just use their numbers